Dragons and Unicorns present Making a Pirate Skirt. You'll need one pair of curtains, 66 wide by 90 inches long or 168 by 229 centimetres, a pair of scissors, a marker pen or French chalk, whichever you prefer, colour matching thread, a sewing machine, hand stitching needles and a bodkin for turning the tubing. This is the lined pirate skirt we're going to make, and I've put it on my tailoring dummy with a white petticoat beneath to show you that you can wear it in many different ways. The ties at the front will give you several different looks, and as you can see it has a traditional drawstring waist, and I've used a contrasting ribbon rather than a matching one and tied it in the back rather than the front, and you'll see why at the end of the video. I spotted this pair of curtains in our local charity shop. They measured 66 inches wide by 90 inches long or 168 by 229 centimetres, had no centre seams and cost me £7.50. A proper bargain. Check your curtains over before you buy. As you can see, they've got nice rings at the top, a good size hem and a matching soft lining fabric instead of that usual hard white stuff. There are also a couple of snags at the top and the rings are coming away from the material. So I'm going to use my nice sharp scissors to cut the rings and snags off and create a straight line to start from. I folded the curtain in half lengthwise and then in half again, but I can do this only because the material is fine enough. If you're using a heavier fabric, you may only be able to fold it in half. And here it is, cut in a nice straight line. The rings can be easily removed and put in the recycling bin. When I saw the curtains in the charity shop, I knew they'd make something really pretty. So before I bought them, I checked them over for problems and issues, folded them down the centre and checked the length just like this. I've separated the material and lining and washed them both to clean away any of the left behind threads and allow the stitching holes to close again. That doesn't always happen, and if necessary you may need to cut them away before ironing the material ready to cut out your circle skirt. I'm laying out the fabric on my cutting board and using the full 35 inches or 89 centimetres width. I've speeded up this next bit, but having folded the top of the fabric down to measure 36 inches or 91 centimetres and checking the fabric is totally flat and that there are no wrinkles, I'm marking the circle at 35 inches or 89 centimetres across the quarter with my chalk marker. Using my scissors, I'm cutting the skirt out using the chalk marks as a guide. If you find it easier, you can use a rolling cutter, but I prefer my scissors because of the arthritis in my wrists. I'm marking the top of the skirt ready to cut it out at 10 inches or 25 centimetres to give me more of a gather at the waist, which is what I'm looking for. Having cut out the waistline and double check the length of the skirt, I'm left with a nice little circle of material which I can use to create a flounce on another project if I want to. Don't throw away your scraps, you never know when you might need them. Using the excess fabric, I've measured what I've been left with and divided that by 3 to get the width of the ruffled piece I'm putting on the bottom of the skirt. I was left with about 20 inches or 51 centimetres, and so I've marked each ruffle at 6 inches, 15 centimetres, and cut them out, squaring off the ends so they can be joined in one continuous piece. I've now got 3 curved strips for the ruffles and the skirt cut out, and it's time to take it all to the sewing machine to edge my pieces. Taking all the pieces to the machine, I use an overlock stitch, which means that the fabric won't fray during wear and washing, so your outfit lasts longer. I apologise for the next piece because I've just bought a new camera and I haven't yet learned how to turn the microphone off, so this next bit is rather loud. I've double checked that I'm on the right side of my fabric by looking at the ironed fold, and I start at the short edge. If you have an overlocker or serger, you can use that, or if you don't have a machine that has an overlocking stitch, you can use a zigzag stitch instead. That's fine. When feeding the fabric through, remember not to push or pull the material, or you'll end up with a roughly looking edge instead of the straight one you're looking for. And I'm now cutting out all of the boring sewing and finishing and noise and finishing it all off camera. Here I am the next day, with all my pieces edged and ready to make into the skirt. I've decided to add a couple of ribbons to the skirt to give it several different looks. To do that, I found the ironed fold and used it as the centre front of the skirt. I then folded that down and measured about 6 inches or 15 centimetres at the top edge of the skirt and ironed in a couple of guidelines to mark where the gathering ribbons will sit. The sharpness of those ironed lines will be very useful when placing the tubing for the ribbon to go in, so make sure you've ironed a really neat crease before bringing it to the board. Using the second curtain, I've cut a couple of strips about 3 inches or 8 centimetres wide and 25 inches or 63.5 centimetres long and edged them on the machine. I've ironed in the side seam allowances at about ½ inch or 1.5 centimetres and 1.5 inches or 3.5 centimetres at the ends. I've also cut a couple of ribbons, folded them in half and created a couple of tubes, and I found the ruffles weren't as full as I wanted, having pinned the 3 strips together, so I cut out another 3 and edged. I've cut a waistband 40 inches or 102 centimetres long and 6 inches or 15 centimetres wide and edged it. From the lining, I've cut another circle with the same waist, and because the lining fabric is slightly narrower, it's shorter than the skirt, but that's okay because I don't want it necessarily to show. As you can see, the top material is quite fine and slightly see-through, so I decided to line it so that it can be worn as a single layer skirt or be put over lots of other skirts for the multi-layered pirate look. Time to go back to the sewing machine. Here I'm showing you the strips I cut to place the tubing in. You can see how I've ironed in the seam allowances at sides, top and bottom. It's also important to keep the ironed centre fold line in place. When it comes to sewing the strip onto the skirt, I have to make sure that the edges are folded properly. If you fail to do this, it won't sit and will make your skirt look really untidy. You need to fold the deep seam allowance down and fold the sides over the top. This gives you a really sharp, neat corner, as you can see here. But if you fold it with the sides in first and then fold the deeper allowance in after, it's possible to find it will slip to one side or the other, as it has here, and give you a really messy finish. Not what we're looking for at all. As you'll see later, I need that sharp ironed fold from the centre line. And now this piece is ready to be put on the skirt, but I've got to go and fetch my granddaughter from school, so I'll leave this until tomorrow. See you then. Yesterday I sewed together all the flounce strips, ironing the seams flat, and in all there's about 14 yards or 13 metres, which will give me a lovely swishy bottom to the skirt. Perfect for any pirate wench. I now need to place my strips on the skirt ready for the tubing to be put in so that it can be tied or hitched up as the wearer wants for as many looks as possible. I found the first of the folds that I ironed in to guide me where the tubing with strips will go, and I'm going to show you 2 ways of putting these onto a skirt. I'm placing it on the table, stretched out flat, so I can pin the strips down where I can see if there are any kinks in either fabric. Before I pin the whole piece down, I'm just checking that the tubing will be long enough to go inside, and it is. I've measured the length of both strips and ironed them to fit the skirt, allowing a gap for the seams of the flounce and the waistband, which will go on the... Sorry for the blurry look here, but I'm still working out the new camera and I will get it set up properly. I've ironed the tubing strips at 3 inches or 8 centimetres shorter than the length of the skirt, and placed the centre line of the tube on the fold. Now I'm measuring half of that length from the top and bottom so it's in the right place for sewing. Yep, all in place. I've speeded up this next piece as we all know how boring pinning is. I'm pinning the top and bottom of the strip first so that they won't move out too much out of place while I pin the rest down. As I pin the strip, I'm using my fingers to feel whether the 2 ironed lines are matching, and if they're out of place, I can adjust the placement before putting the pin in. And if it folds to the right place, you've got it right. I discovered this water-soluble tape a little while on a famous auction site. Bought a roll to see if it would work, and I fell in love with it. It comes in a roll, just like double-sided sticky tape, and I've put it down on the folded seam allowance on both left and right edges of the strip, ready to stick it into place. As I get to the end of the strip, I don't quite go to the edge, so that when I cut it, it sits exactly on the end and doesn't get in the way of the presser foot on the sewing machine. I made that mistake when I first used it and glued my presser foot in place. I wondered why it wasn't moving. Luckily, because it's water soluble, I took the foot off, wiped it off with a wet cotton bud, and did the same to the excess tape. Problem solved. Now I'm ready to stick it down to the skirt. A top tip here, because fabrics slip and slide on each other, is do not take the entire strip of backing off the tape. Make sure the skirt is flat on your work table because you don't want wrinkles or bumps anywhere. And once you've got the skirt flat with your placement line really straight, peel off a couple of inches on both left and right sides of the strip at the same end. I did it on the bottom edge here, as you can see. Remember to measure your gap at the bottom skirt edge, as you don't want it to look uneven with the other strip. Fold the backing strips at a 90-degree angle and press it down with your fingernail to make sure it stays in place when you put it down. Now, having put it onto the skirt and press the water-soluble tape down until it's stuck, you can line the 2 pieces up, pin the top edge in place, and peel the tape back a couple of inches on each side as you keep checking that it's still straight. It takes a little practice with the tape, but as with everything in life, perfect practice makes perfect performance. And once you've taken all the backing off and the strip is stuck down, we're ready to take it to the sewing machine. I've threaded my machine with the matching colour thread because I don't want stitches to show. If you want to use a contrasting thread, feel free. This is your skirt and you do what you want. I always start my permanent stitching, whether it's seams or top stitching, by sewing forward for 10 stitches, reversing over them, and then carrying on sewing forward. The reason I do this, and not only a couple of stitches as others do, is because I want my costumes to last more than just one wear. Of course, if you were being historically accurate, you'd stitch this visible sewing line by hand, but I'm not worried about that with this skirt, so the machine it is. When I get to the end of the strip, being a belt and braces kind of girl, I finish with the same forward, reverse, forward step, and then use the lock stitch as well. Once I've done that, I cut my threads, leaving a long piece, so that I can pull them through to the back later and knot them as well. My seams do not come undone easily. I've moved the strip over to stitch the centre line, and that needs to have an inch or 2.5 centimetre gap at the top, so the tubing will fit in. But again, I'm using the forward reverse forward method for both the start and finish of the row of stitches. Moving over to the left side seam, my sewing machine has the ability to move the needle to the left or right of centre. So when I'm sewing something on an edge, I can stitch on the extreme side of the seam while still keeping the presser foot in the edge of the two seams, but having enough of the foot on the fabric to keep a good purchase and allow the feed dogs to do their work. That side's finished, so I can tie off the loose threads on both ends of the stitching. I'm pulling the top thread through from underneath the skirt and tying it off with 3 knots. Having cut the ends off short, I can then use a little bit of fray stopper glue if I need. I've completed sewing the strips down, and now I need to fade in the tubing. When I put the safety pin on the end of the tubing, I make sure that the seam is all facing the inside of the strip. As it's straight, a twisted tube will create a lump in the skirt and ruin the line when you wear it. Not a good look. Once the tubing's fed through on one side, I pin it at the bottom so I can't pull it too hard and end up having to refeed the whole thing. Been there, done that, not doing it again. Now that's secure with a good length to grab when I level it up, I take the tube and make sure it's still straight. I feed it back down the other side of the holding strip. Don't pull it all the way through at the top, as you need to be sure that it's laying properly. To do that, I push the tubing all the way to the bottom using my fingers and wriggle the safety pin through without catching on that fold over. I've got the tubing all the way through and levelled it up at the bottom. Then I remove the pin and go back to the top, making sure the tubing isn't twisted before finding the centre. Slowly pull the tubing through until it's almost sitting inside the strip at the top. Now I can pull the tubing through whilst folding the centre in a V shape to be sure that it sits flat inside the strip. I'm putting my fingers inside to check it's definitely not twisted before I hand stitch it in place and close the end of the strip down with more hand stitching. I'm not doing it on the machine as I don't want it to move out of alignment during that stitching, and a sewing machine will do that. I'm doing this slowly so you can see the shape that I'm making here. Again, I'm feeling the tubing to be sure that it's laying perfectly flat before those stitches go in. Now this is the line that I'll use to hand stitch, and the centre of the tubing will also be stitched so that it can't be pulled through by accident, or worse, when the skirt's being washed. Having sewn the second strip and tube in place on the skirt, it's now time to work on the ruffle for the bottom. I've already hemmed the edge by hand because I didn't want the stitches to show, and I've loaded the machine with white thread and moved the needle to the extreme left of centre so that my gather stitches are slightly away from the seam when I stitch it to the skirt. I've also altered the stitch length to the longest because I want these stitches to be removed when it's all sewn together. As those stitches do have to be removed, I will not use the forward, reverse, forward stitches that I've used on the other seams. Now I've got to the end of the ruffle, I'm going to pull a good long length of thread out. You'll see why when I've done the other row of stitching. I've left that long thread on the machine, and that'll start the next row of gathering stitches. I've kept the needle position where it was, so the next row will be far enough away to be easily pulled out when it's all finished. A lot of people suggest that you use thin piping cord and a zigzag stitch for this kind of gathering, but I prefer this method because it tears less of the fabric on a really long piece such as this. Yes, it does take longer, so use what suits you best. I'm working on that second row of gathering stitches and won't bore you with showing it all again. Just remember not to use the forward reverse forward movement again. I've left that same long thread at the end, and now I'm going to gather it all. This will take some time, but it will be worth it at the end of the day, so I'm pushing my machine out of the way to give me a bit more space to do the gathers. I'm right-handed, so I gather from the right side. If you're left-handed, then you'll just need to reverse these next directions. First of all, I go to the left edge with the correct fabric side facing and tie the thread ends together, but I make sure they're slightly loose. If I can get my scissors in the end of the thread after tying them, I'm happy. Go back to the right hand end and separate the threads and tie the back threads together. Don't cut these too short. You'll see why later. Holding the fabric in your hand as though you were trying to hold a bird without it flying away, or squeezing it so hard it can't breathe, pull gently on your loose top threads with your right hand and spread the gathers down the fabric with your left. Be gentle and take your time. Holding too tight with either hand will make those threads break. Having finished my gathering, it's now time to pin the ruffle to the skirt. Firstly, I'm pinning the tubing up out of the way. You definitely don't want it stitched between the ruffle and the skirt hem, otherwise you'll have to unpick a few inches and it'll take much more time than just pinning the tubing away. I've measured the length of the skirt hem and gathered the ruffle to match. When pinning the ruffle to the skirt, take care and be sure that the right sides are together. I usually pin a couple of feet and then put the skirt either up to me or my mannequin to double check that I've got the ruffle on the correct side. Sometimes you've started wrongly, and if you have, it'll be a massive amount of work to repin it. Like pinning isn't boring enough. Pin the ruffle all the way around the skirt's hem and then it'll be ready to take to the sewing machine and secure the whole thing. It's beginning to look like a proper skirt. I've brought the pinned skirt to the machine and set the needle over to the middle left of centre. I'm also checking that neither of the tubing strips have been accidentally caught in the pins. Even though they were pinned back, it's not unusual for pins to fall out, so always check these things. Also make sure before you start sewing that the skirt is level with the ruffle and hasn't been caught in the pins, creating a huge lump, or even worse, that they've caught the two sides of the skirt together, which will mean more unpicking. As you stitch around the hem, keep checking that the skirt isn't caught up at all. You may have noticed that I haven't started this seam with the usual forward, reverse, forward stitch. Because the skirt's a full circle, I'll be coming back to the beginning anyway, and here is where I'm going over the first stitches, reverse over those and the last 10 stitches, and then go forward again, finishing with the lock stitch. Cut the threads and pull them through to the back of your work and knot them off just like this. I've been removing each of the pins as I've been sewing. When I finish, I then go round the hem and double check that all the pins are gone. Time to remove your gathering stitches. Take a sharp pair of embroidery scissors and with their points carefully pick up a gathering stitch. I find the easiest ones are right next to a fold in the fabric. Carefully snip that stitch, turn your fabric over and find the other side of it which will be looser and cut that stitch too. Keep pulling on the threads carefully and then cut the ends. By turning from the back to the front of the work and back again, you'll find eventually it will all come out. Don't lose patience with it or you'll cut the fabric instead of the stitching. If it gets too stressful, make a cup of tea or put it away until tomorrow. Take your time and avoid disasters. Having taken out all of the gathering stitches, It's now time to sew the tubing in place and close its covering strip at the top. I've put a double strand of thread into my needle, and in order to secure it I use a large knot. To do that, I wind the ends of the thread around the top of my finger, and then inserting the needle through the little space between my finger and the nail 3 or 4 times. I then slip the loop carefully off my finger and hold the ends and the unknotted piece of thread and pull gently and slowly. That'll create a nice large knot, and holding the centre of the tubing, I insert the needle from the back of the work through to that centre tube. Holding the centre of the tubing, I stitch a star shape through all the layers just to keep it in place, and then working on the back of the fabric I make small stitches towards the corner of the strip. I make sure that I don't sew through more than one layer of the fabric because I don't want those stitches to show, and then repeat the same thing on the other tube strip. The tubing is now pinned out of the way, and I need to find the centre front of the skirt because I want the drawstring of the waistband to be in the back. You'll see why later. Using the strips as a guide, I fold the centre of the skirt so they line up and place a pin with a red glass head to mark both the centre front and back. Each time I mark the waist with a pin, I just double check that it's all correct by pulling the skirt taut and repinning it if necessary. I also need to remember to put the lining into the skirt. Almost forgot there. I use the ironed fold to identify the centre front and back and pin that inside. Usually the lining would go in with the wrong sides of the material together, but because the lining can be another layer to the skirt, I'm putting it in with the right side of the lining facing the wrong side of the skirt. Stretch the skirt out between each pin as I'm doing here, and that'll help keep the 2 pieces of fabric in the correct position. Keep checking your pins haven't fallen out. It does happen, and it's not good. See what I mean? Now to add the waistband. Again, I use the red head pin to mark the centre front, and luckily the ironed fold shows me precisely where that is on the waistband, and I'm going to use that to place it. I put the right side of the band onto the right side of the skirt at the top edge. A waistband needs to fold up and over to create our tube to put our drawstring, elastic or ribbon inside. The skirt is a full circle, but the waistband has edges that will need to be sewn together. Normally I'd probably just sew the 2 ends of the waistband to create a ring of fabric, but I want a gap to be able to put my drawstring into. So to find the sides of the waistband, I need to allow an overlap at the back, which can be hand stitched together, as you'll see in a minute. Using that overlap, I put the yellow pins to match up the sides of all the fabrics. I'm pinning the waistband to the skirt and its lining, making sure that I check I haven't pinned the back to the front or the side to the back. Yes, I've done that too, and it's not fun. Use each quarter pin marks to pin short sections together, and that way if the phone rings or you need to put it down, you can come back to it knowing where you are. I usually work from the centre front to the right and then return to the centre and work to the left. It keeps the work more evenly pinned and you can see your errors more easily. This is a difficult part of the skirt as it's easy to catch the band, skirt or lining in a lump on the machine, and that'll mean you'll have to unpick sections and re-sew them. I pinned the ends of the waistband back to be sure I have a closure to stitch together later. I've started stitching at the centre back, and as I sew I'll remove the pins before the machine reaches them. Or if you've had your machine several years the way I have, you find you can place those pins so that the needle doesn't hit them. Be sure to wear safety goggles and sew slowly if this is the first time you use that method. I close the stitching on the machine the way I always do, with the forward, reverse, forward system. As you saw, the last pin holding the folded edge of the waistband has come out, so I'm going to replace that pin. The back of the waistband is going to take a lot of stress because of using the drawstring tie. Thus I'm going to sew over, back and over the seam further than I normally would, so it will be good and strong during use. Making that closure good and strong will make your skirt last longer, and because it can be worn in many different ways, you'll have lots of different looks. I've returned the stitching to the centre gap so that I've got long enough threads to use to hand stitch the waistband closure. Of course you don't have to do that, but again, it's the way I like to work. Use the way that suits you best. You can see how long I've left the threads, and I can use a slightly larger eyed needle to close the waistband using those threads. I've taken the waistband to the ironing board and ironed down the seam allowance for the edge of the band, and I'll use that folded allowance to sew down to the back of the band, like this. I've turned the skirt inside out and am pinning the waistband in place before stitching. Be very careful which way you pin, as if you catch a pin when you're sewing with the edge of your hand, you'll bleed all over your lovely skirt. Unless of course you want a bit of blood for extra realism, that's up to you. I've picked the threads up that I cut off the machine and pulled them down to the outside of the skirt, and that will stop them from getting tangled in your sewing needle. I've threaded my needle with my colour matched thread, and I'm using a double strand for strength. I'm going to start sewing by placing my knot in the corner of the waistband and then folded the seam allowances back into place before starting my tiny neat stitches. I sew using the machine stitches holding the waistband on as a guide because I know they'll be straight and even. I go from one of those stitches up to the edge of the waistband at about 45 degrees. Check often that your stitches are not showing on the right side of the skirt. You could of course pin the waistband down and use your sewing machine, and if you don't mind that line of top stitching showing, then go ahead and do it. It's your skirt and this tutorial is just a guide. You don't have to follow it to the letter. I've sewn a tight stitch and gone into the edge of the seam of the band and skirt to sew a couple of stitches, knotting the thread each time. I've used the overlock stitch to help hide the end of the hand sewing, and I'm using that same seam to attach my new threads to the waistband. Once I've sewn the whole waistband down, I'm using the centre of the seam allowance to knot the spare thread off. That means that the thread won't work its way free from the inside of the waistband and start unravelling. Having finished sewing the band down, I can now turn the skirt inside out, and I can use the long threads that I cut off when I finish the band seam. I've cut them a little shorter to make sure that they're the same length, and the needle I'm using has a slightly larger eye, so the two threads will fit through together. I'm using those threads to close the front of the band using small stitches and alternating the needle between left and right sides. The stitches have to be as tiny as you can manage because you don't want them to be seen. Keep sewing the gap closed up and over to the inside. I want to be able to hide the ribbon or drawstring inside the skirt if I want to. If you want your string to show, then start sewing from the inside instead. When you reach halfway down the other side, then you can tie off the threads. I've slowed down the speed here so you can see how I'm finishing the seam in order that it won't unravel. This area takes a lot of stress because of tying and untying the ribbon, so you need to be certain it's absolutely secure. You don't want your skirt coming down. I'll keep working on the finish of the closure so it won't come undone, and also double checking that my stitches aren't coming through to the right side of the skirt before pulling the needle through and cutting off my thread. The safety pin's my go-to item for feeding ribbons or strings through belts. I usually push the folded ends of the waistband in with my safety pin so they'll lay flatter and are less likely to catch as I feed the ribbon through. The best ones are the click closing nappy pins, but take it carefully and a normal safety pin will happily work. Choose whichever kind of ribbon, elastic or drawstring you want to use. You could go for a wide or a narrow ribbon like these and colour match or contrast as you like. But if you want to have an elasticated waist, cut a piece to fit your waist measurement, less 1 inch or 2.5 centimetres, and having fed the elastic through, pull both ends and overlap them and stitch together. When I use the elastic for the waistband, I mark it on one side at both ends, particularly when you're using a broad elastic. When you feed it through, you'll find that it'll often twist over itself, and if you've marked it, then the difference will show because the marks won't line up at one end. With my black ribbon, which I'm using for my skirt, I measure at least 2.5 times my waist measurement, and since ribbon frays easily, I cut it in a reverse V shape. Ordinarily, to stop the ribbon being pulled all the way through, I'd put another safety pin across the end of it, but that's unnecessary here because the ribbon's much too long for that to happen. And when I put the safety pin into the ribbon, I fold the ribbon in half because it'll fray as it gets pulled through the band, and that means the pin could slip off and I'd have to start all over again. That's not fun. Feed the safety pin through, being aware of the possibility of it catching on the seam allowance, so just take your time here. Keep feeding the ribbon through and remember to pull the band straight again at the opening. As you get towards the other end of the band, take it a little slower as you don't want to get the pin trapped under the fold. When you get back to the opening, use your hand just to push the waistband out of the way of the safety pin. Wriggle it around until it comes out of the gap. Remove the safety pin and pull the ribbon through, levelling it up so that you can have it as close to equal as you could. Keep gathering and stretching until you have the ribbon as equal as possible. Because I want to replace the ribbon to change the colour every now and again, I'm not sewing the centre of the ribbon to the band, but if you want to, you can. Once you've got the ribbon equal, you need to gather the skirt with it and make sure you're getting the look that you want when you're going to wear it. The fabric's quite similar to taffeta in that it remains stiff even after it's been washed. If you keep gathering and stretching, when you shake it out, they'll naturally fall into place and it'll help with the perfect pirate look. I trim my ribbon ends either in a V or a 45-degree angle and heat melt them with the match, or use fray stopper glue to prevent the ends fraying. Your skirt, your choice. Having now finished the skirt, it's time to tie the ribbon in a double bow and wash it on the setting that takes the least amount of time, as it only wants the water-soluble tape washing off. And here's the finished skirt with a white petticoat underneath. Layers for me are a good look. I've put the drawstrings at the back so that if you're wearing a corset, you can use the excess ribbon to lace it up with, and that helps to cut down on gapping when you bend or stretch in your outfit. Of course, that's just a suggestion, so here I'm tying a bow, which I would knot over again to keep it secure, allowing the loops to be as large as possible and letting the tails fall naturally down the back of the skirt. Or you can hide them inside if you prefer a neater look. To change the look, you can undo the bows and pull one of the front tubing strips as tight as you'd like. Here I'm shortening it as far as it will go and retying the bow to keep it neat. You could add a petticoat with a stiffer fabric to give it a fuller look to the skirt, And often after you've done the first gather, you'll find there's a little more slack that you could shorten the skirt with. Choose your own look. You might leave the skirt as it is, or as I'm doing here, you can turn the gathered portion to your hip, but only if you've not tied it into your corset, of course. You could then pull the ruffled hem to a hanging skirt lifter, or you might like to gather the other piece of tubing to create a more swagged look like this. You can gather this as loose or as tight as possible and leave it where it is and have it at the centre again. The look is really up to you. Try as many ways as you can think of. For instance, you can let the right side down and have the gather on just the left, or vice versa. And you don't have to use just the tubing to raise part of the skirt. Loosen the tubing all the way down and retie it at the bottom. I've got a really sparkly brooch which I've had for years, and I'm pinning it to the bow at the bottom of the skirt. The weight of the brooch might make it fall oddly, so position it as you find best. Pinning it low or high gives you a completely different look. There are, of course, leather loop skirt lifters you can attach to your belt to get a similar look. Have fun and see how many ways you can find to wear your skirt. A couple of extra skirts underneath, a fuller petticoat, or the addition of a flintlock and tankard over it could make a whole different outfit. Please feel free to share images of you in your creation in the comments below, and I'll post the best ones on video. The skirt's finished, but to see more of our making of videos in our costuming series, please remember to subscribe to our channel and like and share with your pirating and cosplay friends. Thanks for watching everyone. Blessings and light to you all. Big dragon and unicorn hugs.